afternoon, everyone. July 20th, 2022. Today on the Mounties for Freedom podcast, I am interviewing Dr. Julie Ponesse. Dr. Ponesse is an ethics scholar. She has a PhD in philosophy, Western University, with areas of specialization in ethics and ancient philosophy. She has a master's in philosophy with collaborative specialization in bioethics from the University of Toronto and a diploma in ethics from the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown University. Dr. Ponesse has published in the areas of ancient philosophy, ethical theory, and applied ethics, and has taught at universities in Canada and the United States for 20 years. In the fall of 2021, Dr. Ponesse saw her academic career of 20 years fall apart after she refused to comply with a Canadian university's COVID vaccine mandate. In response, Dr. Ponesse recorded a special video directed to her first-year ethics students. That video went viral. Since the release of that video, Dr. Ponesse has joined the Democracy Fund as the ethics scholar focusing on educating the public on civil liberties. And since her departure from the university, she's also written a book published by the Democracy Fund titled My Choice, The Ethical Case Against COVID-19 Vaccine Mandates. It's her account of the battle and its aftermath, written with passion and intelligence. Dr. Ponesse's story travels beyond the personal and examines the ethical and philosophical dimensions of our pandemic response. If there's anyone out there who feels alone in the struggle to preserve personal choice and freedom, this book offers some very human advice on how to move forward and make it clear that your voice deserves to be heard. You can learn more about the book and order your very own copy at mychoicebook.ca. So I have my signed copy of the book right here, which was gifted to me by Dr. Ponesse. See, a nice little personal message to me and my family. I've encountered Dr. Ponesse in person a number of times at different events that we have spoken at. And then, of course, we crossed paths at the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. And that's when I got my signed copy of the book. And actually, of note, I didn't even realize this until much later, after I read through the book, was that Corporal Daniel Bulford, former Corporal Daniel Bulford, is even mentioned in the book in Appendix 1. She writes a little couple paragraphs about me, one of the people that she has met throughout this process of speaking out from various processions. So I'm very flattered. Anyways, today's show, Dr. Ponesse and I focus a lot on her viewpoint, her expertise in ethics, and trying to navigate that area between individual fundamental rights and freedoms versus the good of the whole, or the greater good, so to speak. We talk a lot about what could possibly have been led to the feeling of disconnection that people had prior to, and what made them more susceptible to the mass formation. And we also talk a lot about, does evidence matter anymore if public opinion is controlled? And ultimately, we finish off with what we have to continue doing in order to make sure that we can reestablish that sense of humanity within the Canadian population, and why it's so important that people have to continue to speak out and continue to connect with others, even that they disagree with, so that we can keep in their front and center in their mind that we are human beings, right? That we're all human beings. We all have our own struggles and our own fears that we're coping with. So please enjoy the show. Thank you for joining the Mounties for Freedom podcast. Thank you, Dr. Ponesse, so much for joining me today on the Mounties for Freedom podcast. I'm sure a good majority of the people that are watching will know who you are and have been following your story, along with people like myself. So, but if you don't mind, if people are just joining because they know me personally, or maybe they're kind of new to the freedom movement, could you just give a little backstory of yourself, of your history? Like, we know like a little bit about your professional background, but kind of like a bit more of a personal touch, like where are you from, where you grew up?
Well, I was born in North Vancouver and then moved back to Ontario when I was about 7. So I've lived most of my life in the Southern Ontario area. And I went to university and studied philosophy in first year, and I kind of rode that train as far as you can go. Ended up getting a PhD in philosophy and taught at schools in Canada and the US for about 20 years. And then last fall, in September, when the mandates came packaged as part of COVID policy at Western, which is where I was teaching, I decided not to comply with the mandate and was terminated in a very public way with cause. And that turned out to be, I mean, these sorts of medical choices used to be personal between yourself and your doctor and private. And we even had legislation to protect privacy like that. But this turned out to be so anomalous, so unusual, so sensational that I recorded a little video about it. It went viral. And I've been sort of doing this kind of thing ever since. I wrote a book about it. I've done interviews about it. And there's really just sort of a never end. Yeah.
Yes, I have my autograph copy right here.
But, there's really like a never ending sort of fertile ground to be exploring these days, because I think so many of us were caught off guard. We're figuring, like, how did we get to this place? I think we thought it was so odd, that the dialogue was so odd, the insistence, the mandating was so strange, especially in Canada. And there's so much myopia, so much doctors not being able to talk to each other. It was very clear, I think, to the average person that scientific debate, discussion wasn't possible. There was one line, one story, one narrative, and if you didn't buy it, you were a crazy conspiracy theorist. And it's just such an odd place we've gotten to. And those of us, especially who are, I think, interested in history and myself, the history of medical ethics and how we got here, there's a lot of excavating to do, a lot of background work to do. So I'm trying to do that work as well as I can, and try to keep things civil to the degree that it's possible. And we've slipped a long way. I think there's just a lot of work to be done.
Well, I was listening to a number of your interviews in preparing for this and reviewing chapters in your book, and I noticed on the back of your book you have it mentions we're living through not just a viral pandemic, but a pandemic of coercion and compliance, and that really resonated with me. And I've heard Brett Weinstein also say that we're I think he said epidemic of cowardice. And I really would like to get you to explain more about your view on that, like especially with the coercion and the compliance, because to me, even when prior to any of our conversations that we've had in the past, when I was trying to look through every bit of legislation and kind of governing documentation about individual rights and freedoms, informed consent has always been such a major part of the medical ethos. And I think even as recently as the 2000s, 2005, 2006, maybe, like the International Code of Bioethics, where it specifically talks about consent must be full and informed and can be withdrawn at any time without fear of repercussion or punishment or stigmatization. So you're the ethics expert, please.
Informed consent, I mean, you say that it was quite common in the medical profession and maybe even in sort of the culture. I find myself wondering now whether that was true, given the kind of amnesia we seem to have now. So I'm not sure. I think we need probably to do a little bit of historical research and look a little more carefully at what was going on in the culture of medicine and in culture more widely, as you say, kind of in the early 2000s, like what's been going on for the last 10 or 10 and a half years. But, working in bioethics and reading articles that would come out, and I can say that informed consent, competence, capacity, a lack of coercion, these were hot topics for decades. right? And I mean, informed consent, there's kind of two elements to it. There's the informational part. There's making sure you have the information you need yourself to make a decision. And that doesn't mean that someone else has the information and you're making the decision on the basis of their say so, right? So we worked really hard in medicine to get away from a kind of paternalist model where you just do what your doctor says because he or she happens to say so. That kind of credentialism or expertism is something we thought was really harmful because it undermined personal autonomy, right? It means that you can't be the author of your own life. Someone else is making a decision that they think is best for you. So we tried to move away from that, and we worked hard to help patients to make decisions that they understood and that they were given the information so they could make decisions. But so there's that informational component, but then the consent part involves a lack of coercion. That's a kind of freedom in thinking, freedom in decision making. And that's more of a moral capacity, right? So there's this, the informational part is what we might call an epistemic element to informed consent. And epistemology is about knowledge, right? Do you have the right information? Do you have the right knowledge? But then the consent part is the moral capacity part. And both are tremendously weak, I'll say, these days, for lack of a better way to put it. So in terms of information, there are a lot of questions about, well, as a person, where are you getting your information from these days? Where are you able to get it from? Well, you might get it from your doctor or other healthcare professionals, but we have found that the healthcare professions, the colleges, everything from physicians to nurses to naturopathic medicine to chiropractic medicine, they're all myopically following this one narrative. So I think it's really hard now. I mean, people have had maybe their family doctors for decades who have seen them through some terrible things, and they've built a real relationship of trust. And now they're starting to hear things from their doctor that doesn't sound quite right. You know, their doctor's saying things like the vaccines are perfectly safe and effective, and meanwhile 3 people in their family have died or have massive strokes and don't feel well. And they're thinking, okay, which kind of information am I supposed to, how do I weigh this? How do I balance it? And you think, okay, well, there, other than your healthcare professionals, there's the media, there's the news that, but we are finding that that is also maintaining this very singular narrative. And it's hard to find, you know, I mean, you don't have to be totally anti-narrative or on the freedom side of things to just look at what's going on in mainstream media and see that there are no contrary voices. It's the same, with very few exceptions, right? It's just the same line all the time. So you think, well, that's not a great source of information. And then our government, there are problems with that too. So getting the information you need in order to work on that data, work on that information is a problem. And then when it comes to giving consent, you need to feel that you are free to do so. And that's really complicated too. So you need not to feel coercion or pressure or manipulation or a kind of blackmail. We have mandates now. What is more coercive than a mandate? A mandate says you do this thing, you put this in your body or else. And the or else is pretty significant for people. It's a loss of employment, a loss of educational opportunities, a loss of relationships, a loss of social status. I mean, it's a big, you know, no, rarely have we seen this. And maybe we've never seen this before in Canada, where someone's health status made such a big, their voluntary choice about their health status made such a big difference to how they were able to fare socially and economically in life, right? Then you mentioned courage earlier, and being able to consent to a procedure, making a decision that you feel is yours, even if it's not the popular one, that takes a lot of courage. And courage just seems to be hard to find these days. I think courage is low, optimism is low, self-confidence is low, apathy is high. We know this from young people. I was talking to a young person months ago, it's probably close to a year now, who said, you know, basically no one under 40 thinks anything good can ever happen again. There's just kind of, so it's hard even to get yourself to be interested in making an informed choice when you just feel like, why does it matter anyway? You feel kind of like things are fated and that you have no control or agency over what is going to happen in your life.
like an increased sense of nihilism overall for like the younger generation.
This is what I'm hearing. I was talking to someone yesterday who does supply teaching in a high school, and she was telling me that young people today are just, yeah, nihilism is a good word for it, just a kind of emptiness, a purposelessness, a lack of meaning, a lack of identity, futility. Why will it matter if I do this anyway? And that's not something that just happens in a year or two. You can lose trust in your government in an instant,
Mm-hmm.
but you can't lose faith in yourself in an instant, I don't think. I think that's something that happens over a long period of time, and we may just see it rise up in a moment when something like the COVID narrative highlights it. But that's a much deeper cultural problem. And you have young. I don't know. Is your oldest a teenager yet?
No, she'll
Not
be
quite.
12. She'll be 12
Yeah,
this
but you're
year.
kind
Yeah.
of getting into this culture, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I was that age, I certainly wasn't worried about the kinds of things that our young people are worried about today. And I think we won't have, you think about civic virtues, things like trust and dependence on others and contribution and attentiveness and respect. I mean, you have to care to begin with about something, about anything. You have to think that your decisions and actions matter at all before you're capable of those more specific ways of interacting with people, right?
So this brings me to a question surrounding information I heard you and Matthias Desmet speaking about, kind of that
Mm.
even pre COVID-19, the lack of connection that people were experiencing and reporting, like this sense of, they had a good percentage of people surveyed felt like they didn't even have one meaningful relationship. They also were feeling like a good portion of the population felt like no satisfaction or meaning from their employment. And so that was ripe for an opportunity for a mass formation to occur when they're with a singular narrative showing you, okay, now you have this invisible enemy that could do tremendous damage to the human population. And these are the things that we need you to comply with in order to become essentially what my interpretation of it was, the hero of your own story, right? So that you can contribute to the greater good. And that kind of gave people that excuse to feel like a sense of meaning and purpose and contributing to the greater good. And so I wonder, based on what you're saying, like how much of a role our disconnection from face-to-face interaction has played in that, when it seems like, to me, one idea I've kind of toyed with is that people being so much more connected to their phones and their computers, their devices, as opposed to face-to-face conversations, could possibly have been a contributing factor to that. And I was just wondering, like, do you think that's reasonable? And if so, do you have any, have you studied any kind of literature that would indicate that's true? Because this is just me going based on my own observations.
Well, I think it's an interesting and insightful observation. And one thing I think is pretty clear is if you, I mean, there are so many historians and writers, journalists even now, who are, I think for whom it is pretty clear that we have hit an all-time low in terms of loneliness and isolation. And there's such an irony to that, because wasn't social media supposed to, I mean, the internet generally was supposed to be a way of connecting us as we became and also helping to promote kind of globalization. But social media is a more personal way of connecting with people within your own tribes with respect to hobbies or vocation or in your family group or whatever it is. So that's ironic because it's turned out to be the opposite. So then the question, I think, is whether or not that's just a pure coincidence. Have we happened to become vastly more isolated than possibly ever before, just as a matter of happenstance at the same time that we are more attached to our personal technological devices than ever, or is there a causal connection between the two? And if we follow something like Occam's principle, which says always go with the simplest explanation. That's a loose paraphrase, but it's the basic idea. The simplest explanation is that it would be a crazy coincidence. It's more likely that they're happening in relation to one another and because of one another. And if that's true, it's a terrible dupe, because we were sort of promised that this phone, this technology will allow us to stay in touch. And I remember even when I was much younger, I think Bell Canada had a series of ads about, staying in touch across the miles. And it was very heartwarming. And, the grandchild would talk to the grandfather on the phone. But this idea that we use technology to keep us together. And now we're finding that that's actually tearing us apart. And I think one of the problems, and this would take someone with more psychological insight like Matthias Desmet than I have, but I think one of the problems is it's just a facsimile for relationship, right? It's not. So people we meet online that we've never met in person, sometimes you meet that person in reality after having had an online correspondence with them or communication with them for months or years. And the reality is quite different from the person that you thought you knew. And I think what's telling about that is that we can represent ourselves in a certain way when we have that guard of anonymity. And this is, I think, the real, I think anonymity is the other side to that coin of isolation. Contemporary society has allowed us to be, yes, more private in some sense. We have all kinds of privacy legislation, and we have privacy technology and ways of guarding your identity online and through banking and, all of these things. And that's allowing us to be more anonymous. It's allowing us to act online without others knowing everything about us. But one thing I think that's done is it's broken us apart. Right? So when we participate in a Facebook group about baking, it's just Julie the baker, and they don't know anything else about me. When I'm doing online banking, it's Julie the driver of the economy, and they don't know anything else about me. But people aren't broken up like that. If you want to really know who a person really is, if you want to know, and if you want to have a relationship with a person, you want the full picture. You want to know what their weaknesses are as much as what their strengths are. And I think it's not surprising then that when we put all of our relationship eggs in one basket, which seems to be what we're doing now, and even when you have Zoom meetings with people, which people did for work for the last 2 years, it's still lonely. I've heard so many people say they get off the Zoom meeting and feel like that wasn't real. It wasn't real. It wasn't, and you and I have been on Zoom calls how many times, but we've also met in person a number of times. And I think if we had not done that, the nature of the relationship would be different, right? It's just different in kind. And so maybe we didn't foresee it, but it's also explainable, I think, why we've gotten to this point. And the thing I worry desperately about is that you and I, being the ages that we are, we didn't grow up that way, right? We grew up in a more face-to-face interacting way. And then personal communication devices came into our lives at some point. But young people now, that's framing their language development. It's framing their self-esteem development. It's framing their sense of identity. And so now when we have these gender issues, and there's this incredible, what's fashionable now is this fluidity between male and female. And it's not correlated with increased levels of self-esteem and happiness. It's the opposite. People are more, young people are more confused or feel more isolated than ever, and are much less connected to their futures. They seem to be less able to envision what their life could look like in the next 10 years, or maybe less interested in hoping for a certain kind of life, Did that answer your question at all? I can't even remember now where we started.
No, that was yeah. My question was about like the lack of face-to-face connection and a trend towards being connected to your device all the time. And I think part of the reason I started thinking in that line. I mean, I've listened to a lot of brilliant people over these last number of years, even pre-pandemic, trying to figure out like where I sat on a number of issues, and even just to try and learn from them, podcasts, audiobooks, they're tremendous opportunity to learn from brilliant people all around the world. And when I noticed when my wife and I were having a conversation recently about how, even though I've been home almost every day for the last number of months since I resigned, I feel very disconnected from my children because I have been spending so much time on a computer or on a phone. And that wasn't traditionally a behavior of mine. Like, before all of this, I had almost no social media footprint. I was very happy to, I would go to work and do my job, and I would come home and I would be home. And, I had a phone for work in case I was called out for an emergency. But other than that, I tried very hard to be disciplined about not texting and stuff like that all the time so that I could be engaged with my kids. Mm-hmm. And so even physically occupying the same space, I feel like less connected to them. And I can see it. I can see it in their behavior, and I can see it in my behavior, how our relationship maybe wasn't quite as tight as it was. Now, I mean, we've been through a very stressful time and a lot of transformation taking place, but that's something that I know I have become aware of, and feel like we both could dial back how much time we are on our devices at home. Mm-hmm. And we were completely imbalanced with speaking out and trying to promote activities that were more freedom movement related, and then that also led me to wonder about what role television, radio, and social media has played in the mass formation. Because I suspect part of the reason why my wife and I didn't jump on board with the official narrative completely was because I don't listen to regular radio when I drive. I listen to podcasts and audiobooks. I don't watch regular television. All we've ever had for the last number of years is streaming services. When we want to watch a movie on a family movie night, that's when we watch it. Mm-hmm. I don't even watch sports anymore, hardly. And so I wonder, I guess I pose the question to you, do you think in your life, do you think that were you consuming mainstream media before or during the pandemic?
Mm-hmm. No, and not actually for a long time before that. I mean, my distrust of institutions like the CBC, for example, happened much before the pandemic. And
me too.
I also have felt, I mean, my personal feeling was that it was, mainstream media is it's a big machine, and it's an entirely consistent one, and there's nothing much new under the sun. And it was, when I asked myself the question, what is this giving me? What is it offering me? Not to be too self-centered about it, but the answer was very little. And so I stopped doing it. It's interesting. There's to your point about being connected to devices, and why is that, and then what are the harmful effects of that? Well, to the first question, been a lot of research about why is it an easy default? And I find that too, in life, when I'm tired, when I'm worn down, the less mental energy I have, the more likely I am to go to the device, to find something in it, to search for something in it. And what the research shows is that what we're searching for is a little dopamine injection. Mm-hmm. We just want a little, philosophers have called this a happiness pump. You click on something and you find, oh, I got 18 likes, or I got 18,000 likes or something. And, oh, that makes me feel a little bit good. But it's sort of like going from here to up here, and then it goes right back down again. And then you need another one. Oh, up, and then right back down again. So social media, and it's great, not just social media, but whatever it is you're going to your personal device for, it seems to be great at giving you a pretty steady supply of tiny little dopamine injections, tiny little happiness pumps. So you're going to feel a little better than you did before going, and there's a never ending source of them, right? But what it doesn't do is give you the meaningful sources of pleasure that create deeper fulfillment in life, that acts more like a positive feedback system, right? Where if you do something that's genuinely meaningful, like you spend quality time with another person, or you do something you enjoy, you listen to, to a podcast that's meaningful to you, you read your favorite book, you spend some time gardening, it doesn't have to be anything monumental, but if you do something that really feeds your soul, it will make you less in need of those little dopamine hits because you're more self-sufficient, right? You already kind of have the happiness pump within you. You're not relying on something. I've got my phone right here, right? You're not relying on this thing to give you the dopamine, because you're already your own source of it. And as you're doing things that support who you are and feed your soul, and reading new things and thinking new ideas and whatever it is, you're just self-generating that kind of happiness. One of the most interesting psychologists I've ever read, he's a Hungarian, and so I apologize, I'm going to get his name wrong, but I'll send it to you after. His name is something like Csikszentmihalyi Mihalyi, and that's a terrible butchering of the name. I think he's passed away now, but he had this idea called flow. And he talked about, when you get really good at something, like so skilled at it that it becomes second nature. I'm kind of thinking about what you used to do for a living, right? Probably initially when you did it, it was really hard and you had to think really consciously about everything. But then after a while, you probably don't even think about getting your equipment set up and all of that, right? When it becomes so easy for you that it's second nature, you just kind of get into this zone, right? And he says that's where like true fulfillment, true happiness lies. And my background as an Aristotelian, I wrote my thesis on Aristotle, and he talks about flourishing, and how flourishing consists in virtue, and virtue is excellence. It's being really good at something, whether it's intellectual virtues like knowledge or memory, or moral virtues like generosity or courage. When we get really skilled as a human being, and that's all internal, right? That's all something that happens inside of you that you work hard at. It gives you long-lasting pleasure for your life, and you don't need something external to give that to you. So I think what that says to me is that we've become a society that, probably as personal devices were entering our lives, the need for, the interest in developing skills came out of our lives, maybe because there was perceived less time because we were spending more time on our devices, or maybe because we thought that connections we were getting through our phones would replace the need to have skills and excellence on our own. But I think we're living the costs of that probably subconscious choice right now.
Okay, I have a question then. I mean, it seems like it's a very powerful force, though. I mean, it has allowed us, or we allowed long-held fundamental rights and liberties to be restrained because of this powerful force. And one of the things I can't help but think of is like when we just accepted that we couldn't see elderly loved ones in their final hours, and the closure of small businesses, and everything else that we have seen building over the last 2 years, like right up into the surrendering of bodily autonomy by a large number of the population, people that didn't take any of the products until they were mandated to do so, but still chose to do it out of the coercion. And so
you're thinking this has to be about more than just little happiness pumps. What's the big draw?
Do, yeah. And so like, and it seems like the argument that is always used, even now when they're taking away mandates, they're still holding on. The employers, or let's say, for example, Alberta Health Services just rescinded their mandates, but they're still holding on to the narrative that when they brought it in during the Delta wave, it was justified to protect patients and to protect each other, and they're thanking their employees who did, kind of the right thing for the greater good, even though the evidence did not support that was true, that it was, they had, public health officials and even Justin Trudeau had previously admitted that it didn't prevent transmission, but they're still holding on to that argument that it was for the greater good. And so I think it's rooted in that somewhere, that sense of meaning that people were searching for, like that reconnection to the group as a whole, like that, and
so
loyalty.
complicated, and I think these are all the right questions. I mean, I think the point about almost a kind of revisionism, right? And you want to justify the decision that you made in the past because you don't want to look like a fool. There's that. But then there's the kind of inattention to harm. So you mentioned the example of people just, in order to follow the mandate, follow the narrative, I mean, they did horrible things. We live across from a retirement home, and we've just heard horrendous stories from loved ones who didn't have much in terms of choice, it seemed, in terms of putting their loved ones there. But once they were there, the atrocious harms happened to them, things that are criminal, that never should be happening in Canada. So you think, well, how do we get to this point where we think it's more important to follow the narrative than it is to avoid all of these harms that we're going to do? How does that myopia possible? I think Matthias is right, largely. I mean, when he talks about mass formation psychosis, I don't think he uses the word psychosis lightly. Like, psychosis is a kind of detachment from reality, and what's coupled with that is a lack of empathy, right? Psychotics are one of the marks of psychosis is that you are unable to empathize with others, and you're unable to recognize the gravity of your decisions and actions in the world, and that it doesn't affect you. And I think we are all a bit psychotic. Most of us, right, are a bit psychotic these days. We've become so connected to this singular tribal narrative that we have become detached from the reality of the harms that our connection to that narrative is doing. You mentioned like meaning, and I think and there's so many interesting questions here about what is it we really crave? Are we trying to protect ourselves and our own interests? And we figure that belonging to and seeking comfort in the group, in the tribe, is the only way to do that. And so we're really self-centered because what matters to us is protecting our own interests. Or are we just trying to find meaning ourselves or together, and we figure it has to be in the group? Is it because I can't figure it out for myself? The group seems to be so confident, they must know the right answer. Is it just a lack of, I mean, the French philosophers Camus, and, he has this image of Sisyphus rolling the stone up the hill continually, only to have it roll back again, right? And this kind of emptiness. Do we just sort of feel, again, I think we're kind of back to what we were starting talking about, right? This futility, like, well, I've tried everything else. I can't find meaning myself. The group seems to be very confident about what the right thing to do is here. And they're offering me membership. And membership comes with a lot of perks these days. I can fly anywhere I want to. I can go to restaurants. Oh, and that ever coveted social approval.
Mm-hmm.
who chose not to comply with the mandates. There's an incredible amount of, I think, self-confidence and courage there, because the way people treat you, the sneers, the terrible, dirty, critical words that are used, ad hominem attacks. It's a horrendous thing to go through. It's like you're running the gauntlet of shame. And so that's what being on the outside of this narrative costs you.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Welcome back. So where we left off was I was asking specifically about the need to be part of the greater good, and how that might be an explanation for the what we've seen with people buying so strongly into the narrative because they're seeking that need to be a part of something bigger than themselves because they're feeling lonely, meaning, or maybe a lack of meaning in their life. And so I guess from an ethics standpoint, traditionally, what has been the kind of the boundary where the individual rights meet the greater good, where there might be a tip, like in the balance of what is more valuable at the time?
Yeah, let me get to, before I get to that, I just had a follow-up thought to this question about why, why we're so drawn to the group and maybe finding meaning. And this is going to be, I guess, a very, very philosophical sort of thought. But, you think about what it is that motivates our actions generally, and what's possible for humans. And I mean, there are facts about our life. One is that we're all going to die, and most of us aren't going to live much longer than 80 years or so. That's it. That's what we've got. And so then there's a question about, well, what do you do with that time? You can either figure out what your potential is and try to actualize it and become that thing, or you can just decide not to bother. And we know that everyone who decides not to bother has a lot of other unpleasant mental health effects that come along with that. Humans are not, it seems, naturally designed for apathy and futility and underachievement.
Mm-hmm.
We want either to have success or believe we're on the path to success, or believe that we can do something to make our lives better, to make the world better. And so there's that fundamental decision, right, that we all seem to want to make, which is, how can I be the best at this thing? But in order to be the best at this thing, you have to figure out what's meaningful, what's valuable, what gives your life meaning. And that's what we seem to be having a hard time with these days. Why we've defaulted to the group, I don't know. It could just be because so many of the historical answers have proven themselves to be insufficient to a number of people, whether we're talking about something philosophical like Marxism or utilitarianism, or something religious like Christianity or Judaism or Islam. A lot of people have fallen away from those things. So there's a vacuum left, right? It's like, well, I need to find another source of meaning. That's hard. That's tricky. I don't know where to find that thing, And then what steps in its place is being offered on a silver plate. All you have to do is do your part to be part of something more meaningful, right? All you need to do is comply with this beautiful story, right? Which is that it's a hero story. You mentioned that earlier, right? That we face this terrible threat, but we can band together and we can conquer it. We can come out the other side, and good for us for working together to do it. And so our meaning comes from conquering our fears and doing that together. This question about, sorry, do you want?
No, go ahead, please finish.
Well, I was just going to say then, the question about, from an ethics point of view, how do you balance individual rights and autonomy with the good of the group? That's been a debate back and forth, as far as I know, in ethics for 3,000 years. We've struggled to understand this, and I think what we settle on is the idea that most are important, but we have to be very careful when one starts coming at the expense of the other to too great a degree. So when we allow people who want to hurt others to do so, then that's too much of a cost to the group. When the group is demanding compliance with an individual and that harms the individual to too great a degree, then that's too much of a cost to the individual. And so, but public health ethics, for example, is really, it's kind of a balancing act where you're trying to figure out what costs are too great and what are the benefits on the other side. And the problem that we have now is that the information that we're figuring into that cost benefit analysis doesn't seem to be accurate. Right. And so we're getting ourselves to the point where we're making decisions, where we're creating policy that's ruining people's lives. and it's not necessary at all. There was actually just, what date are we at now? It's about a week old now, I guess, a decision out of Italy. I don't know if you've heard about this, where the court in Florence actually ruled in favor of a psychologist who didn't want to be vaccinated. And the court actually said that these injections don't prevent infection and transmission. And so for that reason, you can't make this argument that the psychologist's interest should be sacrificed for the sake of the group, because the injections don't protect the group anyway, right? So there can't be an obligation. So it's really interesting. That's the first substantial decision really we've seen that seems to recognize and uptake accurate information about what these shots can and can't do.
Well, and so I'm trying to look at it from my own personal experience as to why I have taken the path I have taken, and how it would be similar to why someone took the opposite. And so when we talk about how that sense of, a lack of connection, a lack of meaning, and then all of a sudden a major narrative arrives on the scene that allows you to become part of something again, that's very attractive. And so when I was listening to you interview Matthias Desmet, I was wondering to myself, like, was the Freedom Convoy my opportunity to regain like that status in myself, right? Like where I left the RCMP, my identity had been completely uprooted. I was no longer a part of my tight-knit team. And then all of a sudden this major event happened, and I was given an opportunity to be a part of something that I believed in, that I believe is, part of the solution out of this problem that we're currently facing. And then I was surrounded by this incredible team of people that all came together with a common goal. And I was accepted, and I was celebrated, and I was even like, heralded as some type of a hero. And I remember people saying things like that to me, and I would say, like, I just said what I thought was true, right? Like that's all I've been doing this.
It doesn't feel bad.
No,
right.
It doesn't. It feels very good. And I mean, I think that's why the energy, people always talk about the energy that was down there at the convoy when you're actually out moving around those crowds of people in those trucks. And it's because we had the opportunity to stop feeling alone and isolated and accepted as part of a much larger group as well. And so I find it very interesting that, like, things that I have been, critical of followers of the official narrative, I can apply that to myself as well, just maybe on a smaller scale.
Well, we often I think that's so interesting and really self-reflective. We talk a lot about the narrative and the anti-narrative, but the anti-narrative position is really made up of a series of little micro narratives, right? They might be people who don't buy the mainstream narrative, but then you've got to tell some story. You have to have something to live for, some reason to connect with other people. And so people part of the freedom movement, there's and there's different versions of that, right? There are people, like, not all the truckers were unvaccinated, right? Because they were more, they were more focused on the freedom issue. And then some of the truckers and some of the people who supported the convoy were very focused on the medical dimension of all of this. And so there were kind of pockets and sub narratives within broader narratives. My experience was very similar to yours. I mean, working in academia for a number of years, some people might have the impression that, in a philosophy department, in a small department, it would be very cozy and quaint. And I worked in a number of small departments. Most of them had sort of 6 or 8 faculty members or fewer, but most of the time it was like ships passing in the night. People didn't work in their offices. People would just go, turn the key and open a door to a dusty office that hadn't been inhabited for days. And, you'd go and teach your class and you'd leave again. And you'd very often hear people in the hallway saying, maybe it's July, and they'd say, well, I haven't seen you since the Christmas party. These things are very common. So it's not like I had this incredibly tight-knit, fulfilling community of academics. And then when I came outside of it, it's just been lonely. In fact, it's sort of the opposite. And so I understand this view that being counter narrative has a certain kind of isolation feeling, but it also provides the opportunity to meet and get the energy from a lot of other like-minded people that's hard to give up. And I agree. I wonder the same thing. I wonder how much of, I'm interested in the truth. I think we're doing incredible harm. Our policies are doing incredible harm, and we're not following the science. We're not following the evidence. We're not being attentive to people's suffering. We're actually really rather deaf to it. But also, I think a question we can ask both of ourselves is, if all of this went away and got cleared up tomorrow, what would we lose in that? And we would both probably lose a commitment to trying to correct a wrong, which gives you also a lot of meaning.
Well, I know me personally, I'm a very task mission oriented kind of person. And so I would have to find another mission that gave me purpose, right? I find like that where I have the most anxiety is when I'm kind of in that ambiguous area of like trying to figure out, okay, what is it I should be focusing my attention on? And then as soon as I make a concrete decision as like, okay, this is my goal, this is what I'm going to focus on, then it's like, I'm on. And that's, I think that's probably very common in people from, well, definitely from my former profession. But I also think that what it really helped me when I was listening to that interview and coming to that conclusion, because, it's been like a roller coaster, right? Lows where I'm thinking about leaving the country, to highs where I'm just like, no, it's going to happen. We're going to get, freedom will be back and things will get better. And it goes up and down, but it's really easy to slip into that negative mindset. And so that, when I started to think about how that was how I potentially could have been susceptible to another form of formation, so to speak. I think that helped me come to terms with a number of, let's say, issues, perceived betrayal, right? Perceived betrayal by my organization, by my team, by my friends, people that turned their backs on me, or at the, maybe not everyone that, maybe they didn't all alienate me, but they went silent and they treated me differently because of an arbitrary date that passed in September of last year or October of last year, and made me realize that, like you mentioned earlier, the simplest solution is usually the right one, right? Life is very busy and people are focused on their own little individual lives. And so when I'm not there at the office every day with those people, they're going to stop thinking about me and they're going to be focused on their life. And if they think I'm wrong and that they are right about, let's say, the mandate narrative, or that maybe that the mandates are acceptable, they're not, it's not necessarily an action of betrayal as I perceived it to be. It's I don't know how to word this properly, but it's more just they've taken their path and they want to believe as well that it's the righteous one.
Well, you don't want, it's inconvenient, isn't it, to have someone start to make you question not only what you believe to be true, but the things that you put the most stock in, the things that you really believe to be true. And it's annoying and very destabilizing to have people around you who question that, right? And say, are you sure you're right about that? I worry, to be honest. I mean, people say to me, well, don't you think people are going to wake up now that it's so obvious that there are so many adverse events from the vaccines? And I say, well, I don't know, because think about the person who's onto their fourth boost, their
Mm-hmm.
fourth shot. And they've been believing for 2 years that this thing was pure. It was the cleanser. It was a safe space. It would make you, it was like putting on armor to protect you from all that was wrong with the world. And now you're being told that you possibly put everything that was wrong with the world into your body and there's nothing you can do about it.
Mm-hmm.
What is the natural human reaction to that? I don't think it's acceptance, accountability, and blaming others. I think it's much more because there's no possible retribution. There's not, as far as I know, right? There's no cleansing yourself from this.
Well, I think
There's no amount of money that the government can pay you, that insurance can pay out. That, I mean, we're seeing insurance companies reporting astronomically anomalous deaths.
mm-hmm. In 18 to 44, right? Like the prime working years age group.
Exactly. And I just got a notice from my bank yesterday saying that life insurance rates are going up. And of course, this sort of thing happens now and again, but I think this is not the last time it's going to happen in the foreseeable future. So my point, though, is that when you've been believing a narrative and you do something that's irreversible and possibly irreversibly harmful to you and your loved ones, including your children, and then you start to hear that possibly there is a harm there and you can't do anything about it, and no amount of money or apology or pharmaceutical invention can fix it for you, isn't denial much more likely?
Well, I think it would be very, very difficult psychologically to accept
I think so.
that especially if there was people that were trying to raise the alarm and you ignored them or even attacked them verbally.
And so I think it's not surprising that we're seeing the narrative shift and hone in. I think we're really at a precipice, to be honest. I think we're either going to see people wake up and enough of them will say, this just doesn't make sense, I'm not complying anymore. Or we'll see a scapegoating phenomenon happen and a honing in on the unvaccinated, because as we see, other viruses, things like monkeypox come on the horizon, which are much worse to look at and so are much scarier in a way, I worry that the narrative machine will spit out the answer, which is that, well, what we needed is 100% vaccination in order for the shots to work at all. And so it was the fault of the small number of unvaccinated people that allowed this virus to stay alive in the population and to mutate. And so what you did wrong over the last 2 years, if anything, is that you didn't put enough pressure. You didn't coerce enough the unvaccinated people. And now the reason that, the statistics are very clear. The more boosters you have, the higher your chance of hospitalization and death. It's just clear across the board from every country in the world. But there has to be an explanation for why that is. And I don't think the most logical one for the narrative holder is that, well, the vaccines are causing these problems.
So I think that is a good place to talk about the solution to how we can try and prevent ourselves from progressing to that final stage of the formation where it can become violent destruction of a small group, right, or of an identifiable group. And that's the question. Keep speaking out, keep speaking out, keep speaking out. And I think a lot of, my personal thought on that was that maybe it's time for me to swallow my pride and go talk to people that stop talking to me. Mm-hmm. And as difficult and awkward as that will be, they need to see that I'm still a human being and that I'm still the person that they knew before. We've had our differences, we've had our difference of opinion, but I'm not a horrible dangerous threat to them and their family.
Mhm.
And that was never, and I never ever would have made myself that way. And hope that if enough people can, like I think you said, reestablish that, like that principle of humanity toward one another, that will prevent them from getting on board with the idea that these people need to be eliminated, right? Like
Yeah,
progressing to that most dangerous part of a totalitarian regime.
yeah, and there's the two elements of I think the picture that people, the pro-narrative people have of the unvaccinated. One is their virological status, and the other is their mental status. And so I think that the picture, that the stigma is that unvaccinated people are not only a viral threat, but they're crazy.
Mm-hmm.
They don't reach conclusions based on evidence. And so removing ourselves from society is going to make it easier to develop and maintain that picture, right? If you go back to someone, and as you say, if the things you say and the things you do and your demeanor are not consistent with what we're being told, which is that the unvaccinated person is crazy, it does plant a seed of doubt, I think. And you'll know from the Matthias interview that he says it's that kind of person. I mean, I don't think there's a quick fix here. This is I often say, people ask me this kind of question, I say, this is a long game with a slow burn. It's changing the culture. It's changing how we educate our children, how we educate ourselves, in whom we place our trust. But we have to start somewhere with that. And, Matthias's view is that it's just that the little words that seem insignificant, speaking in the ears of those who accept the narrative consistently over time has been the only thing that has ever prevented us from reaching that worst fateful end, which mass psychoses, which we've never seen anything on this kind of scale, but smaller versions of that have always reached in the end. And so I think it can feel futile when it seems like no one in your family or friends agrees with you. When you watch podcasts, freedom podcasts, and they have 300 views or 4,000 views, and then you see something on CNN or something Trudeau says and they have 3 million views. It can be easy to get to feel like your efforts are empty. But I think what we have to do is accept that our effects always will be small, but that they will build together and create a cumulative effect, that it's like a little nagging in the back of people's minds. And I have heard a number of, personal testimonies to that effect, that, someone's triple vaccinated brother started, you're hearing the same thing over and over again, and kind of changes the mind a little bit. And then you hear something again a couple of months later, and then you see something for yourselves. And then you think, yeah, I do know 3 people in my life who just dropped dead while running. And isn't that a little bit odd? 1, maybe not so much, but 3 starting to get a bit peculiar. And now I really don't know what to do about the 8. It's, and I think also it can be very easy. If the anti-narrative view starts having more success, it could be very easy to feel and portray a sense of entitlement, right? And to give the impression that, see, we were right all along. And I think that has to be resisted, because there's nothing more offensive about that, for one thing. But also it fails to recognize that people really are doing their best with what they have, and that we can make some pretty, we can have some pretty terrible outcomes in our lives by making what we perceive to be the right decision all along, but we actually made the wrong decision because just a tiny little thing went wrong. And in this case, the tiny little thing is who we trusted, and a little less courage than we probably needed to have. So I think we have to really resist gloating and feeling entitled and badgering. And as you say, sticking by the spirit of humanity, or the principle of humanity, and showing people that we're real, we're human, we care about other people. One thing I often say is, we are all in this together, but that doesn't mean what we're told it means. It doesn't mean we have to do exactly the same thing. It means that we're human and we recognize the humanity in other people. So we're willing to cooperate and work together with empathy and respect. And that doesn't mean agreeing all the time. It doesn't mean complying ever. Compliance is never good. Agreement with following a rule you believe in is one thing, but that's not compliance, right? Complying is doing something when you don't believe it's right. And so we should never be complying with anything, right? The fact that we have an epidemic of compliance is I think the real viral problem in our world today.
Well, and I think to your point about how the gloating type reaction has to be resisted, I think that division that has been created and has been fostered, it's what we need to reverse on a mass scale. And if we react in that manner, then we are guilty of what we've accused the others of doing to us, right? That's superiority complex.
Yeah.
And I think that, oh, okay. One final thing then I guess I'll say is that, it seems like the difference is that it's easy to blame a Justin Trudeau or maybe even a World Economic Forum for everything that's happening to us. But I think we need to take responsibility as a population that we are allowing these policies to take root because we have not spoken out against them, because we have self-censored ourselves. And so I know we've had a little back and forth about my pattern recognition of the deny, divide, and distract. And I think how we can counter that is to admit our own shortcomings or our responsibility for what has occurred. Try to unite people based on common ground, common fears, common desired outcome, and focus instead of letting yourself get distracted by the next popular thing, right?
Focus is that's a hard one these days.
It is hard, and because there's so many things going on globally, but you have to focus on what's within your control, right?
Absolutely. We've just decided, and I have to run, but we've decided that none of those things you just mentioned are our responsibility or our job, and we've just outsourced them to the government that we've either decided or have been told will take care of us. And we used to have a healthy distrust of politicians and media, I think, and now we've had this decline of or we've had a rise of deference because we just think that all those things are up to other people. They'll work on it, they'll output an answer, and then we will do what they say. We're living the costs of that now. And I think you're right. We need to take back control, not just of decision making, but about the sources of information on the basis of which we make those decisions. And also realize that politics is not what happens in Ottawa. Politics is of the people. It's what happens. It's how you treat your neighbor. It's how well informed you are about issues. It's how tolerant you are of people. It's how you work together. And I think you're right. We need to stop the division and the conquering and sort of reclaim what we've known how to do all along.
Mm-hmm. So unity, a message of unity, and consistently speaking out to make sure that people still see you as a human being. Because as soon as if all of us were to stop speaking out, that's when we would become most vulnerable to a far worse outcome.
Absolutely. And attention, giving people our attention.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I know you have to go. So thank you so much for your time today. I honor you for your courage and your integrity. You're a massive inspiration to me and to my entire family. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Danny. Take care.
Take care.